everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Well, this time we're taking a look at the Southern California news highlights from the Observer Group newspapers.
Okay.
And these are from February 5th, 2025. Looks like we've got a pretty wild mix this time. We've got a crazy Lakers trade,
Oh, yeah.
some deep cuts into Black History Month, political maneuvering, and some pretty inspiring community resilience after all those fires.
Yeah, that's a lot to cover. It's amazing how all this stuff is happening at the same time. Really makes you think about it. Everything's kind of connected.
Right. And speaking of interconnectedness, what about that Luka Doncic trade?
Seriously.
I mean, Lakers fans have been photoshopping him into purple and gold for years, and now it's actually happened.
I know.
I'm still trying to process it all.
It's definitely one for the history books. I don't think anyone saw this coming.
So let's break it down for those who haven't heard yet. The Lakers sent Anthony Davis, Max Christie, and a future first-round pick to the Mavericks. And in return, they got Doncic, Maxi Kleber, and Markieff Morris.
Wow.
Oh, and the Utah Jazz got in on the action, too. They picked up Jalen Hood-Schifino and a couple of second-round picks.
So what's the thought behind all this? What are these teams trying to achieve?
Well, it seems like the Mavericks GM, Nico Harrison, is really focused on building a strong defense, and he wants to do that with Anthony Davis as the main guy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Davis was a huge part of that Lakers championship back in 2020.
Yeah.
And his defensive stats are really impressive.
Definitely. He's been selected for the NBA All-Defensive Team 4 times, and he consistently averages over 2 blocks and a steal per game.
He's a defensive powerhouse, no doubt. But we can't ignore the fact that he's 31 now, and he's had his share of injuries.
Yeah, that's the big question mark, isn't it? Especially when you consider that Doncic is only 25, and he's already considered one of the most dominant offensive players in the league.
And it's not just about scoring points. It's his ability to control the whole game with his passing and basketball IQ. He's a triple-double threat almost every night. And he puts so much pressure on defenses. Very few players can do what he does.
Exactly. I mean, he's averaging 28.6 points, 8.7 rebounds, and 8.3 assists per game over his entire career. That's already the 3rd highest points per game average in NBA history.
That's insane. So is this a good trade for both teams?
Well, it's a huge gamble for both of them.
Right.
The Mavericks are hoping that Davis can stay healthy, and the Lakers are betting on Doncic continuing his incredible rise.
It could be a huge what-if moment in NBA history. We'll have to wait and see.
I know. I've already got February 25th circled on my calendar. That's when the Mavericks play the Lakers in LA.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be an epic rematch,
Oh,
especially if Davis is back on the court by then.
I definitely want to watch that.
All right, well, let's shift gears a bit.
Sure.
It's February, which means it's Black History Month. And The Observer highlighted some really interesting places in California with amazing stories about Black history and culture.
Yeah, I saw that. It's a good reminder that Black history is woven into the fabric of California, even in places you wouldn't expect.
Absolutely. I thought it'd be cool to focus on a couple of places that might resonate with you, our listeners.
Sounds good.
Well, have you ever heard of Allensworth? It was founded back in 1908, and it was actually the only town in California founded and governed entirely by African Americans.
Wow. That's a huge accomplishment, especially back then. It really shows the vision and determination of the people who built it.
For sure. It's a story of resilience, but also kind of a cautionary tale.
How so?
Well, Allensworth's survival was tied to a railroad company and a water company, and eventually both of them stopped servicing the town, and that's what led to its decline.
It's a reminder that even when Black communities created self-sufficient spaces, they still faced systemic challenges.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's jump to Leimert Park in Los Angeles.
Oh yeah, I've heard of Leimert Park.
It's an awesome cultural hub. It's known for its incredible jazz scene, and they have one of the biggest Juneteenth celebrations in the country.
Yeah, Leimert Park's a great example of a community that celebrates and nurtures Black culture. It's a beacon of artistic expression and social engagement.
And it's still thriving today. But, okay, moving on to a heavier topic now.
Okay.
Besides all the excitement of the Lakers trade, there's this serious issue brewing that could affect the education of a lot of Black students. The Observer covered President Trump's executive order to temporarily freeze federal loans and grants.
Oh yeah.
And there's a lot of concern about how this might impact historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs.
That's a valid concern. HBCUs have played a vital role in creating a Black middle class and providing access to higher education for generations of Black students.
Congresswoman Alma Adams, who represents North Carolina, a state with a lot of HBCUs, is worried about this funding freeze. She thinks it could disproportionately affect these institutions. especially because the freeze specifically targets programs related to race and equity.
That's a good point. I mean, it seems kind of counterintuitive to target those specific programs within institutions that are focused on Black history and culture.
Exactly. And it's adding to the anxiety that a lot of these institutions are already facing. HBCU leaders like Walter Kimbrough, who's the interim president of Talladega College, well, they're really emphasizing this point. They're saying that this 90-day review period is causing a lot of uncertainty and anxiety.
That's understandable. Uncertainty can be really unsettling, especially when it comes to funding for education.
Especially when you consider the fact that there are mixed messages coming from the White House. On one hand, they're saying that HBCUs are fine,
Right.
but then they add this caveat about the funding freeze for programs related to race and equity. It's confusing.
Definitely. It's a situation we need to keep an eye on because the potential impact on HBCUs and their students could be huge.
Absolutely. Okay, let's switch gears again to a story of resilience and community spirit after the Eaton fire in Altadena.
Yeah, that fire was just devastating.
It burned over 14,000 acres, destroyed over 9,400 structures, and it's already being called one of the most costly disasters in U.S. history.
Wow. It's hard to even imagine the scale of that destruction.
And within all that devastation, there are so many personal stories of loss and recovery. The Observer highlighted one story in particular about Jerry Allen, an 84-year-old resident of Altadena who lost her home in the fire.
Oh gosh, that's heartbreaking.
And what makes her story even more poignant is that she was actually recovering from leukemia
Oh no.
and had just come home from the hospital when she had to evacuate because of the fire.
It really makes you appreciate the things we take for granted, doesn't it?
It does, but even amidst all that loss, it's been incredible to see the community come together to help each other.
It's those moments that really highlight the strength of the human spirit, our ability to come together and support each other in times of need.
The LA sports teams have been amazing too. They've donated millions in aid and supplies to people who've been evacuated. It really shows the power of community.
It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there's still hope. There's still compassion. There's still a sense of community that can help us through these difficult times.
Yeah. And even in the midst of all that generosity, there are still these personal stories of loss. Jerry Allen's nephew, for example, lost his Rams Super Bowl jersey and some autographed memorabilia in the fire.
Oh, wow.
And it might seem like a small thing compared to losing a house, but those items have so much sentimental value.
Absolutely. They represent a part of someone's history, their identity. Those are the kinds of losses that are often overlooked.
And while everyone's now focusing on rebuilding and getting ready for future fires, there's also a legal battle brewing. A law firm is claiming that exposed wire at a Southern California Edison tower might have contributed to the fire, and this could have big consequences down the road.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. As the investigations continue, the questions about accountability are going to become more prominent.
Speaking of accountability and responsibility, are you up for a quick rundown of some other political news from The Observer?
Hit me with it.
Okay, first up, Attorney General Bonta managed to block that federal funding freeze we were talking about earlier.
That's huge for California. It means that funding for essential services, things like wildfire recovery efforts, education, and public health, will continue.
Exactly. All right, next up, Senator Padilla introduced something called the American Music Fairness Act.
Okay, what's that about?
Well, it's aimed at making sure that artists actually get paid for radio airplay.
Interesting. Especially after the Grammys, where so many Black artists won big. Maybe it's a sign that people are starting to recognize the value and contributions of musicians, especially those from communities that have been marginalized.
Right. Okay, moving on. In recognition of Black History Month, Apple has launched their Unity Collection.
Oh, I saw that.
It includes a special edition Apple Watch and support for organizations that focus on creativity and community within the Black community.
You know, sometimes those corporate gestures feel kind of empty, but this time Apple's actually doing something really interesting. They're not just selling products, they're actually supporting organizations doing important work in those creative fields.
That's a great point. And it's not just corporations getting involved. We've also got LA Rises. It's a huge $100 million campaign.
Wow.
And it's being led by Governor Newsom, Magic Johnson, and a bunch of others
What's the goal?
to help rebuild LA County after those wildfires.
That's ambitious. But with that kind of financial backing and the people involved, it's possible. They could actually make a real difference.
Yeah, I hope so. Okay, now we've got a bit of a political head-scratcher. Senator Padilla's questioning President Trump's statement about the military turning on the water in California.
Yeah, what was that all about?
Apparently, President Trump said that the military entered California and restored water flow from the Pacific Northwest.
Hmm.
And he said they did all this using emergency powers.
Hold on. Entered California and used emergency powers. That sounds pretty serious.
It does, right? Padilla's asking for clarification on what actually happened.
That's understandable. Deploying military forces within the U.S. is a pretty significant action. There should be a lot more transparency about what happened and why.
Exactly. And so far, the Department of Defense has been totally silent on the issue.
Wow. That silence speaks volumes, doesn't it? It makes you wonder about the accuracy of President Trump's statements and what his motives might be.
It really does. Okay, let's get back to that LAO report on wildfire FAQs. It's full of information about the factors driving California's wildfire crisis. It really highlights how complex the issue is.
It's not just one thing, right? It's climate change, how we develop land, forest management practices. Everything's connected.
Exactly. The report points to this alarming statistic about how many houses have been built in the wildland-urban interface. They call it the WUI.
The WUI, what's that?
It's the zone where houses are built near or even within wildland vegetation.
So it's where the houses meet the wilderness.
Yeah, basically. It's the front line of wildfire risk. And between 1990 and 2020, the number of houses built in the WI increased by 42%.
42%. That's a huge jump.
It is. And the problem is that we're expanding into these fire-prone areas, but we're not changing the way we build or plan communities to lessen the risk.
We can't keep doing things the same way and expecting different results. We need to be smarter about how and where we build.
Absolutely. And it's not just about where we build, but how we build. The report talks about the need for fire-resistant materials and landscaping.
That makes sense. If you're going to build in a fire-prone area, it's common sense to use materials that can withstand a fire.
Right. Using stuff like fire-resistant siding, roofing, and decks can make a huge difference. And then landscaping with plants that are fire-resistant creates a buffer zone around your house.
It could literally save your house from burning down.
Okay, so we talked about development patterns, but what about climate change? What role does that play in all of this?
Well, the report is pretty clear that climate change is a big factor. Drier conditions, hotter temperatures, more extreme weather, it all adds up.
It's like climate change is setting the stage for these mega fires.
Exactly. And it's already happening. The report mentions studies that show climate change has increased the chances of fire-prone weather conditions by 35% and their intensity by 6%, and it's only going to get worse.
That's a scary thought. It really makes you realize that climate change isn't some far-off problem. It's happening right now.
And it's fueling these devastating fires. The report also talks about something called unhealthy forests.
Unhealthy forests. What does that mean?
Well, it turns out that a lot of California's forests are overcrowded with small trees and underbrush.
So too many trees can be a bad thing.
In a way, yeah. When the forests get too dense, it creates a fuel ladder for wildfires. The fire can climb from the underbrush into the canopy of the trees and create a huge crown fire that's almost impossible to stop.
Oh, wow. I see. So what's the solution? Do we need to cut down more trees?
It's more complicated than that. It's about managing the forests to keep them healthy and strong. One important tool is controlled burns.
Controlled burns. You mean like setting fires on purpose?
Yeah, but it's careful controlled, of course. It might seem counterintuitive, but these prescribed burns help get rid of some of the flammable stuff in the forest, which helps prevent those massive destructive wildfires.
So it's like fighting fire with fire.
In a way, yeah. It's using fire as a tool to manage the landscape. The report also talks about thinning, which means selectively removing some of the smaller trees and underbrush. This creates a healthier forest structure.
Okay, so a mix of prescribed burns and thinning can make our forests more resistant to wildfires.
Exactly. But there's no one solution that works for every forest. It takes a science-based approach that considers the specific conditions of each forest.
It sounds like we need to be proactive, not just reactive when it comes to wildfires.
Absolutely. We can't afford to wait for the next fire to start. We need to manage our forests actively, adapt how we build, and deal with climate change if we want to protect our communities.
We've covered so much today, from that huge Lakers trade to the aftermath of the Eaton fire and all the complexities of California's wildfire problem. We've talked about politics, community strength, and individual stories of both loss and hope.
It's incredible how all these seemingly different things are connected. That's one of the things I love about doing these deep dives.
It helps you see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even with all the challenges, there's always hope. Whether it's communities supporting each other after a disaster or people working towards a better future, There are always reasons to be optimistic.
I love that. We've gone through a ton of information in this deep dive so far. And before we jump into the rest of the LAO wildfire report, there's an update on that whole military turning on the water thing.
Oh, right. What happened with Senator Padilla's inquiry? Did the Department of Defense respond?
Well, Padilla sent a formal letter to the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, demanding more information. He wants to know, the basics.
Like what exactly?
Like which military units were involved, where exactly they were deployed, what specific actions they took, and under what legal authority they were operating.
Yeah, those seem like pretty reasonable questions. Given that deploying the military within the U.S. is a big deal, you'd think there would be a lot more transparency about it all.
Right. And guess what, crickets? Total silence. The Department of Defense hasn't responded to Padilla's inquiry at all.
Wow, that's pretty concerning. That silence just raises even more questions like, were President Trump's claims even true? And what were his motivations?
I know. Okay, so let's get back to that LAO report on wildfire FAQs. It's seriously packed with insights into what's driving this whole wildfire crisis in California.
It's a really complex issue.
Right. It's not just one thing, and the report does a great job of explaining that. One thing that really jumped out at me was this statistic about how much housing has been built in the wildland-urban interface.
The what? Sorry, the wildland-urban? What was it?
The wildland-urban interface. They call it the WUI for short.
Okay. And what is that exactly?
It's basically that zone where houses are either right next to or even mixed in with wildland vegetation.
Oh, I see. So like where the suburbs meet the wilderness.
Yeah, exactly. And that area is like the front line of wildfire risk. And get this, between 1990 and 2020, the number of housing units in the WUI increased by 42%.
Wow. 42%. That's a huge increase. No wonder we're seeing so many devastating fires.
It's crazy, right? And we just keep building more and more houses in these high-risk areas, but we're not changing the way we build or plan our communities to actually make them safer.
Yeah, that's a problem. You can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome.
Exactly. And it's not just about where we build, it's also about how we build. The report stresses the importance of using fire-resistant building materials and having fire-resistant landscaping.
That makes total sense. If you're building a house in an area that's prone to wildfires, you should use materials that can actually withstand a fire.
Right. Things like fire-resistant roofing, siding, and decks can make a huge difference. And then having landscaping with fire-resistant plants creates a buffer zone around your house.
So it's like creating a defensible space.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've talked about building and development, but what about climate change? What role does that play in all this?
Well, the LAO report is very clear that climate change is a major contributing factor to these wildfires. Drier conditions, hotter temperatures, and all those extreme weather events, it all creates the perfect conditions for megafires.
It's like climate change is setting the stage for disaster.
Exactly. And those effects are already being felt. The report talks about studies that show climate change has already increased the likelihood of fire-prone weather conditions by 35%, and the intensity of those conditions has increased by 6%.
And that's only going to get worse as climate change continues. It's a wake-up call for sure.
It really is. Climate change isn't some abstract concept in the future. It's impacting us right now, and we're seeing the consequences in these devastating fires.
Absolutely. Okay, so another thing the report mentions is this idea of unhealthy forests.
Unhealthy forests. What does that mean?
Well, apparently many of California's forests are overcrowded with a lot of smaller trees and underbrush, and this makes them more vulnerable to wildfires.
Wait, so having too many trees is a bad thing?
In a way, yes. When a forest becomes too dense, it creates what they call a fuel ladder. The fire can easily spread from the underbrush up into the canopy of the trees, creating these massive crown fires that are nearly impossible to control.
Oh, I see. So what can be done about that? Do we need to cut down more trees?
It's more complicated than that. It's really about managing forests in a way that makes them healthier and more resilient.
How do you do that?
Well, one way is through prescribed burns.
Prescribed burns. You mean intentionally setting fires?
Yes, but in a very controlled way. It might sound counterintuitive, but these prescribed burns help reduce the amount of highly flammable stuff on the forest floor, which helps to prevent those big, out-of-control wildfires.
So it's like using fire to fight fire.
Yeah, exactly. It's about using fire as a tool to manage the landscape and make it less prone to those catastrophic wildfires. Another important tool is thinning. That means selectively removing smaller trees and some of that underbrush to create a healthier forest structure.
So a combination of thinning and prescribed burns can help make our forests more resilient.
Exactly. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Each forest needs a specific approach based on science and the unique conditions of that forest.
It sounds like we need to shift our thinking from being reactive to being proactive when it comes to wildfires.
Definitely. We can't just wait for the next fire to happen. We have to actively manage our forests, adapt our building practices, and take climate change seriously if we want to protect our communities.
It all comes down to being responsible and making informed choices.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot today. From the Lakers' big trade to the aftermath of the Eaton fire and all the intricacies of California's wildfire crisis. It's been a roller coaster of a deep dive, from political maneuvers and community resilience to those heartbreaking stories of loss and glimmers of hope.
It's incredible how all these seemingly unrelated events connect. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this deep dive format.
It really helps you see those connections, right? And how everything fits together in the bigger picture.
Exactly. And even amidst all the challenges and setbacks, there's always hope. Whether it's seeing communities come together to support each other after a disaster or individuals working tirelessly to make a difference, there's always a reason to be optimistic.
Well said. It's been a very informative deep dive so far. It really makes you think, doesn't it? We started with a surprising Lakers trade, then dove into Black History Month, talked about devastating wildfires, and all those political twists and turns.
It's been quite a journey. And yeah, it really highlights how everything's connected, even when it doesn't seem like it at first.
Exactly. But as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm struck by a sense of, well, hope, actually, despite all the challenges we've talked about. What about you?
I did that. Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
It's not just about feeling hopeful, though, right? It's about doing something, making choices, no matter how small, that can actually help create that future we want.
Absolutely. And that takes us back to Black History Month. Earlier, we touched on those incredible stories of Allensworth and Leimert Park.
Right.
But those are just two examples, right? They're part of this huge, rich tapestry of Black excellence, resilience, and culture that's woven into the very fabric of California and the whole country, really.
It's true. We tend to focus on those big, well-known events and figures, but there are so many untold stories, hidden figures, and local heroes just waiting to be discovered.
It's a reminder that Black history isn't just about the past.
Right.
It's about the ongoing fight for equality and justice, for representation, and all of that's still shaping our present and our future.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that those struggles are still very real today, like we saw with that whole issue of the federal funding freeze and how it could impact HBCUs.
It's a stark reminder that we need to stay informed, engaged, and keep working to break down those systemic barriers that are still holding people back. We need to create a more just world for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. You know, a lot of what we've talked about today shows just how interconnected things really are. From the impact of climate change on those wildfires to the ways those historical inequalities still affect us now, it's clear that we're all part of a larger system.
Yeah, and that means that the choices we make, our actions, they all have ripple effects.
It's a powerful reminder that we have a responsibility to understand those systems we're a part of, and then do what we can to make things better, to create positive change.
And that responsibility touches everything we do, right? From the things we buy to the policies we support, and even just the way we treat each other in our communities.
It's about making choices that align with our values and contribute to building a better world for everyone, including future generations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Southern California news, I'm left wondering, what can we actually do? What actions, big or small, can we take to create that positive change in our own communities?
That's a great question to end on. It can feel overwhelming, for sure, but even those little acts of kindness, raising awareness, and getting involved in our communities can have a big impact.
It's about realizing that we all have a role to play in building the future we want. And as we've seen today, that future has both challenges and opportunities. It's up to us to choose which path we take.
That's a really powerful thought. It's been great exploring all these topics with you today.
And with you, our listeners, remember, every deep dive is unique just like you. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.